All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. I'm sorry, getting started a few minutes late. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Baruch Meir and Rina Duman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in the schus of a refuah shlema for their niece Chava Tzipora Bas Chaya Malka. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Choli Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. But with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Tzadik Tes 99, and we are picking up at the Mishnah, on Tzadik Ches Amud Beis 98b. So the Mishnah, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 15 lines up from the bottom. An interesting case. Chomish Noshim Shinis Arvu Vlado Sehen. So you have 5 women whose children got mixed up at birth. Now, just to give you a bit more context over here, take a look at Rashi. Shines arvu vladosein zechorim. So you have 5 women who had 5 boys. And again, at the hospital, these 5 boys got mixed up. So we know that these 5 boys belong to these 5 families. What don't we know? Specifically, which boy belongs to which family. Now, in addition to that, Rashi says, now, every family also has another son that's definitively their son, for which there's no ambiguity, there was no mix-up. Okay, so now what happened? Higdilu hataruvos. So we'll call it the mixed-up sons. That's what we'll call them, right? The mixed-up sons grew up, v'nasu nashim, and they got married, umesu. And now what happens? And now they passed away. They passed away. So now, what's the problem over here? Now, the case over here is where we'll call it the mix-up brothers went ahead and they're not brothers themselves. In other words, these 5 boys who belong to these 5 families, but for whom there's ambiguity, who belongs to which family. So they went ahead and they grew up, they got married, they passed away without children. So now, what's the problem? The problem is each of them has a brother. We just don't know what. We don't know what. Whose brother is whose? So what do you do in a situation like this? So this is actually very interesting. So arba'a choltzin la'achas. So we'll say essentially what we do is 4 brothers go ahead and do chalitza with each of these women. And what happens? Ve'echad miyabim osa. Ultimately, again, and then we'll call it the last brother has the ability to do yibum. Because interestingly enough, by the time we go ahead and we get to the last brother, one of 2 possibilities, which is if any of the previous brothers, we'll call any of the previous brothers were the actual brother of the deceased, then by now they've done chalitza. And halacha lamaisa, this woman now is permitted to marry this last man. And if for some reason none of them were the brothers who did chalitza, and the last one is the brother, then what? He's doing yibum and he's fine. So the Gemara says, similarly again, hu ushlosha cholzin la'achos ve'echad miyabim. So we'll say, and this is what we do for each of these women in question. So you have 4 of the brothers do chalitza, and the last brother does yibum. Now, so when we say the last brother does yibum, what does that actually mean? The last brother can do yibum, right? He doesn't have to do yibum, but meaning the last brother can do yibum. Nimsa arba chalitzos v'yibum l'chol achos v'achos. Therefore, it turns out that each of the women in question over here will have chalitza 4 times and yibum 1 time. Good, that's the case. Says the Gemara. Now, the order over here is very important. It has to be that halacha lamaisa chalitza comes first and then yibum. In other words, the order is specific. That first there are 4 brothers who will go out and do chalitza, and the last brother then has the ability to do yibum. Aval yibumi bereish shalo, but ultimately again you can't start with yibum. Why not? The Gemara says, "Dikapaga biyevama l'shuk," because the possibility is, if the first brother were to do yibum, and halacha lamaisa, he is not the surviving brother of this we'll call it surviving brother-in-law of this particular widow, then it turns out that he's marrying a woman who is subject to yibum, and of course that's problematic. The only way to obviate that is to first have her do chalitza with 4 out of the 5. And then the 5th has the possibility for yibum. So the Gemara says, "Maihu ushlosha cholzin la'achos." So I'll say, what does it mean when it says he and 3 other brothers do chalitza? Delo tema liadminu chad lekulu. So Rabbi say, technically speaking, what you could do is you could do this same setup and have the same brother do yibum with all 4 women. right? Or all 5 women. In other words, technically speaking, you could have, right, brother 1, 2, 3, and 4 go ahead and do chalitza, and brother 5 goes ahead and does yibum. And you could use the same 4 brothers for chalitza and the same 5th brother for yibum in all the situations. And one man will end up marrying 5 women, to which the Gemara says, we don't want that. We don't want one man doing yibum with all 5 women. Rather, what we prefer, ultimately, again, is for each of the brothers to perform one act of yibum. Now, why is that? The Gemara says, Dilma misramya lady day. Because Lamaisa, the advantage of having one brother, right? If each one of the 5 brothers perform one act of yibum is why? Because maybe it'll turn out that the woman he's marrying is actually his sister-in-law. As opposed to if you have one man do all 5 acts of yibum, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, what do we know for sure? At most, one of them is his actual yevama, but 4 of them are not. This way, if each of the brothers is doing an act of yibum, there's at least some statistical probability that each brother is actually performing a mitzvah. Incredible. Miktzasan achin umiktzasan she'ein achin. So I will say some variations of the case. So let's say again, some of them are brothers and some of them are not brothers. So I will say if you take a look at Rashi over here, Rashi says miktzasan achin umiktzasan she'ein achin. Rashi says over here, miktzasan shel vadoin Achin libnei hataruvos min ha'av. Actually, let's read the rest. Mitzasen achin, mitzasen she'in achin. So she'in achin, mitzasen achin, mitzasen she'in achin. Ha'achin cholzin, v'she'in achin miyabmin. The ones who are brothers do chalitza, and the ones who aren't brothers do yibum. Now, what does that mean? I will say, in other words, that this whole halacha is only by brothers. Maika Amr, what does this mean to say? I will say first wide line on the bottom. So Maika Amr, Amr Av Safra Hachi Kamr, this is what it means to say. Miktzasen achin min ha'av, u miktzasen achin min ha'eim. Oh, so let's say again in this group, you have 2 different groupings of brothers. Some of them, one part of the group are paternal brothers, and one part of the group are maternal brothers. So achin min ha'eim cholzin, the maternal brothers will do chalitza, va'achin min ha'av miyadmin, and ultimately again the paternal brothers will do yibum. I both say this is talking about in the mix-up case over here. So let's say again, it's not a homogeneous group. So if you have part of them being paternal brothers, part of them being maternal brothers, but again, remember the problem is we don't know whose brother is who. Have the maternal brothers do the chalitza, and the paternal brothers do the yibum. Another interesting case. Miktzasen kohanim, miktzasen she'ein kohanim. Let's say part of the group are kohanim, part of the group are not kohanim. So kohanim cholzin, the kohanim do chalitza, she'ein kohanim miyabmin, and the non-kohanim do yibum. So I will say so again, the Gemara goes weiter. So, and remember, the reason for that is because why? Because yibum is only done after you've done 4 chalitzas. Remember again, the process with each of these women is 4 chalitzas and then a yibum. So the problem just is, if the kohanim are going to do the yibum, so if it's not his yevama, he's marrying a woman who had chalitza. Now, is a kohen allowed to marry a woman who had chalitza? Mid'oraisa, yes. Mid'rabanan, no, because we give her a status of a quasi-grusha. So the Gemara goes weiter. What happens if part of the group are kohanim and part of them are maternal brothers? So elu ve'elu choltzin v'lo miyadmin. In all of these cases, both of these brothers or this entire group will do chalitza, and no one will do yibum. Because again, we're nervous to allow yibum in this situation for the kohanim, lest he end up doing yibum with a woman who's not his sister-in-law, and he married a woman who therefore had chalitza, and achin mina'im maternal brothers, because maybe there's no din of yibum at all. Good. Tan Rabban, I will say top of Tzaddik Tes. Some interesting cases over here. Tan Rabbanon. Yesh choletz li'imo misafek, la'achoso misafek, libito misafek. I will say sometimes you could have a situation of a man who does chalitza with his mother out of safek. Now, what this means is as follows. Yeah, well, it is what it sounds like. Right? In other words, he does chalitza. Well, again, you'll see how it plays out in just a moment. Right? Ultimately, again, does chalitza with his mother from safek. Or really what it means is, well, we'll see. La'choso misafek or libito misafek. What's the case? Here we go. Keitzad imo. Keitzad. So the Gemara says, what's the case? Imo v'isha acheres. So we'll say, imagine for the following situation. You have Ruvain, right? Ruvain. So Ruvain's mother and another woman. V'lahein shnei zecharim. They each have two, right? They each have a son. V'chazru v'yaldu shnei zecharim b'machba. And now we'll call it, and now mother, we'll call her Imo, and another woman give birth. So they each have a son. Then I will say they're in hiding. They're in hiding. And they each give birth to another son in hiding. But what happened? What happened? There's ambiguity about when the two boys who were born in hiding, there's confusion about who belongs to who. Who belongs to who? And what happened? Uba b'nashal zeh v'nase imo shal zeh. Uba b'nashal zeh v'nase imo shal zeh. And I will say what ends up happening. Let's keep this easy for just a moment. Let's call them Rachel and Leah, right? So Rachel and Leah each have a son. Each have a son, Ruvain and Shimon. Okay? So now what happens? Those are their definitive sons. Now Rachel and Leah are in hiding. And in hiding they give birth to another two boys, right? Another two boys. The problem, we'll call them A and B. The problem just is that we're not sure who belongs to who. So what happened? Now Ruvain ends up marrying Leah and Shimon ends up marrying Rachel. No problem with that, right? Because they're unrelated. The two women, Rachel and Leah, are not related. Rachel, right, has a son, Ruvain. Leah has a son, Shimon. Each son ends up marrying the other woman. Totally permitted. Totally permitted. Here is the problem. So the Gemara says, Umesu below banim, and what ends up happening? Ruvain and Shimon die without children. So Rabbi says, remember again, now what do you have? You have these two other boys born in captivity. No, I'm sorry, not in captivity, in hiding, right? But what's the problem? We're not sure who's Ruvain's brother and who's Shimon's brother. So what ends up happening? So I will say, so zeh cholitz l'shtehen, v'zeh cholitz l'shtehen. So what's going to end up happening? So brother number one will end up doing chalitza with Rachel and Leah, and brother number two ends up doing chalitza with Rachel and Leah. So I will say, what does that show? Nimtza kol echad ve'echad cholitz li'imo misafek. So I will say, it turns out that's what? Each one of these brothers ends up doing chalitza with his own mother out of safek, right? Potentially he's doing chalitza with his own mother. Pretty fascinating case. So la'achoso misafek, I will say, what's the case of achoso misafek? So I will say this is a case of two women, right? Two women who go ahead and give birth to girls in hiding. So I will say, so what happens? They're brothers, right? Brothers, not from the same mother, go ahead and come and marry these girls. Umeisu below banim, and they die without children. So what has talacha? Choletz l'shtein. Each of the surviving brothers is going to have to do chalitza with each of these two girls, and there's the possibility that they're their sisters. Nimtza choletz la'achosa misafek. That's the case where you can end up doing chalitza with your own sister misafek. Okay. Lebito misafek kesad. What's the case of one's daughter misafek? What's that case? So the Gemara says, Ishto v'isha achares sheyoldu shtei nekevos b'machava. So we'll say, so what happens? Here's the situation. Let's say a person's wife and another woman end up going ahead and giving birth to two girls in hiding. Uba achehen, and ultimately again, in this case, we'll say achehen means the brothers of the father. The brothers of the father come along and marry these girls. V'nasum umesu below banim, and ultimately they die without children. Zeh choletz lebito misafek, v'zeh choletz lebito misafek. So I will say, in this case, you can have a situation where each of these men end up doing chalitza with their own daughters out of safek. Okay, we'll say just fascinating cases. So Tanya, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer, Ish v'isha pamim shemolidin chamesh umos. So we'll say another very fascinating case. So here we go. Ish v'isha. So sometimes you could have the following scenario. A man and woman could have children from literally 5 different nationalities. Now what it means is, in one relationship, you could have children with 5 different designations. Watch. Ketzad, Yisrael shalakach eved v'shivcha min hashuk. You could have Yisrael who purchased an eved and a shivcha from the marketplace. So I will say these are non-Jewish servants. He purchases non-Jewish servants in the marketplace. V'lahen shnei banim, and ultimately again this eved and shivcha, they have two sons. And I both say, if I'll point out over here, Rashi says, it's Rashi all the way on the bottom by the intermediate lines, V'lohen, v'lokana as binan. Ultimately, again, in this case over here, the children were not included in the sale. So in other words, let's see. So let's see, watch this again. So the Eved and Shivcha have two sons. And one of them converted, Nimtza echad ger ve'echad oved kochavim. It turns out that one of them is a ger and one of them is an oved kochavim. Okay, hit bilon. If now the man goes ahead and what? He immerses his eved and his shivcha l'shem avdus, right? And so now again they're official avodim. V'niskeku zelozeh, and ultimately again they have relation. They have a child. Hare kan ger va'oved kochavim ve'eved. So I will say, so now I've got a ger, an oved kochavim, and an eved. Shikhr es hashivcho ba'ala. If you emancipate the maidservant and then have relations with her, so ubala eved, and the eved has relations with her. Hare kan ger, oved kochavim, eved umamzer. Now, both say, where did the mamzer come from? Right? Because we're going to see ultimately this reflects the opinion that when a Jew has a child with a shivcha, ultimately, again, or I should say, an eved has relations with a Jewish woman, that offspring is a mamzer. We'll see that in just a moment. Shikra shnein v'yisiyan zelazeh. If you emancipated both of them and then they married, so harei kan ger, oved kochavim, eved umamzer v'yisrael. Okay, so I will say, again, just all the different offspring coming from this union. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malon." So what is it coming to teach us? So I will say the novelty here is what I just mentioned. Oved kochavim ve'eved haba bas Yisrael havlad mamzer. So the novelty over here, I will say, is in that last piece, which is that an oved kochavim and an eved who have relations with the Yisrael, ultimately the offspring is a mamzer. That's the novelty in this case. Okay, Tanarabana, let's go weiter. This is a fascinating case. Yesh mocher es aviv lahagbos imok suvasa. You could have a case of a guy who sells his father in order to pay off his mother's ksuva. Okay, watch this. Ketzad Yisrael lakach eved v'shivcha min hashuk. A Yisrael bought an eved and a shivcha from the marketplace. And what happened? V'lahem ben. They had a son. Now Rashi points out over here, V'lahem ben, v'lokanas haben. The son was not included in the sale. So he purchased an eved and a shivcha. They had a son before, son was not included in the sale. Okay, now watch this. V'shikhr es hashivcha. And then the master emancipates the shivcha. And what happens? V'nasa. And he goes ahead and marries her. So I'll say, so just to illustrate this over here. So Reuven goes ahead and purchases an eved and a shivcha from the marketplace. Okay, they had eved and shivcha had a son. We'll call him Bob. Right, so Bob. So what happens now? Reuven emancipates the shivcha. He goes ahead and he marries her. Okay, remember, once he emancipates her, what's her status? She's a Yisraelis. So now he goes ahead and marries her. Watch this. Va'amad v'kasav kol nechasav libna. Then I will say, interestingly enough, what does Reuven do? Reuven leaves all of his property to his wife's son. Now remember again, who is his wife's son? Right? So again, Bob, right? The non-Jewish kid is his wife's son. So now Reuven is leaving all of his property to Bob. Watch this. So now watch this. If Reuven dies, now all of the property is left to who? Is left to Bob. Now Bob has an obligation to pay out his mother's ksuva. Guess who's part of the property of the estate to go ahead and pay his mother's ksuva? His unemancipated father. Right? His unemancipated father. Remember again, Bob's father is Eved, right? So ultimately, again, you could have a situation where halacha lamaisa, a son is selling his father, so Bob is selling his Eved father to go ahead and pay for his Jewish mother's ksuva. Okay, just pointing it out. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malan." Okay, what is this coming to teach us? So the Gemara says, "Kul Rabbi Meir hi va'avda metaltali u'metaltali mishtabdi l'ksuva." So I will say, it could be teaching us a very important lesson, which is that this reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that avodim are considered to be movable property, and movable property is encumbered to the ksuva. So that could be what we're coming to learn over here. The Ibai was saying the other possibility is no, hakamash malon avda kimakarka dami, or no, an eved in fact is not metaltalin, but rather an eved has the status of karka, and that's why ultimately again it's meshubah to the estate. Okay, I will say the point of all of these. What's the point of all of this? I will say it's just to show you again these cases, although obviously they're far-fetched, are wonderful ways for the Gemara to go ahead and teach us how certain principles and concepts kind of intersect with each other. Good. We'll say Mishnah. Ha'isha shenis ariv vlada bevlad kalasa. So an interesting case here. What happens if you have a situation of a woman whose child gets mixed up with the child of her daughter-in-law? Okay. Higdilu Hataruba. So what happens? So we'll say, so what happens? So now let's say they grew up, right? So then we'll call it the mixed up kids, right? The Taruvos grow up, Vinasu Nashim, and they got married, Umesu, and now they die without children. So what's the halacha? So Bnei Hakala Cholzen below Miyabmin. So ultimately, again, the sons of the son of the daughter-in-law go ahead and do chalitza not yibum, right? Shu safek eishes achiv, safek eishes achi aviv. So ultimately, we'll say, so again, these are just it's the same principles. So ultimately, again, in this case, the son of the kala, the son of the daughter-in-law, so this is the definitive son of the daughter-in-law, ultimately does chalitza and not yibum. Why? Because halacha lamaisa, the widow is safek eshes achiv. The widow might be the wife of his brother, but she also might be safek eshes achi aviv. She might also be other possibility is that she is the wife of the father's brother. So Bnei Azekena, the son of we'll call it the son of the mother, right? The son of the mother, not the daughter-in-law, but the son of the mother. So Bnei Azekena, O Cholzin O Miyabmin. They could either do chalitza or yibum. Why? Shesafek eshes achiv ve'eshes ben achiv. Because we'll say the two possibilities that they have is either this woman is the wife of the brother, or ultimately again the wife of the son of the brother. Okay, Meisvak Ksherim. What happens if ultimately again we'll call them the Ksherim? Now we'll say the Ksherim in this case means the brothers who are not mixed up, right? The children who are not mixed up, the children whose paternity is known. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says Meisvak Ksherim Hata'aruvos libnei zekena choltzim v'lo miyamin. So the children whose identity is not fully known. So for the Hata'aruvos libnei zekena choltzim v'lo miyamin, they do chalitza not yibum. Why? Mishu safek eshes achiv ve'eshes achi aviv. Ultimately, again, because this is a case of safek eshes achiv. Maybe it's my brother's wife, and maybe it's the wife ultimately of the father's brother. Libnei akala. What about to the sons of the kala, the daughter-in-law? Sorry, the widows of the daughter-in-law. Echad cholitz. I'm sorry, the sons of the daughter-in-law. Echad cholitz ve'echad miyabim. Ultimately, one does chalitza and one does yibum. Okay, so we'll say, so fine, good. Now we move on to a separate case, separate category. Kohenes shenis ariv vlada bivlad shivchasa. So we'll say now, over here, we're continuing in the case of kind of mixed up at birth, but a different ramification at this point. Up until now, we've been focusing on yibum and chalitza. Here, we're now shifting gears a little bit. So here you have a kohenes, Kohenes shenis ariv vlada bivlat shivchasa. So here I have a case of a kohenes, right? So I will say, so this is either the daughter of a woman married to a kohen, which is called a kohenes, right? So she has a shivcha. Now remember again, shivcha, non-Jewish servant. They're living together in the house. Now remember again, I will say, what's the halacha? who's in a Kohanic home, everyone who is either related to the Kohen or owned by the Kohen is permitted to eat truma. That's the halacha. So in this case over here, Kohenes and her shivcha give birth at the same time. And what? Their children are mixed up. So we don't know which child belongs to the Kohenes, which child belongs to the shivcha. So what's the halacha? Hare elu ochlim b'truma. Now I will say, here's the interesting part. Everyone is allowed to eat truma, right? Why is everybody allowed to eat truma? Because miman of shach. If you are the son of the Kohen, the Kohenes, then you're a Kohen. And if you're the son of the shivcha, then what? Then you're a son of a shivcha. Either way, you're permitted to eat truma. To which v'cholkin chelek echad bagoren. Now we'll see exactly what this means. Halacha l'maisa, and it sounds like what it means is they receive one portion of truma in the granary. We'll see exactly what that means in the Gemara. Amud Beis ve'enon mitamin lamesin. And I both say, remember again, neither of these boys are permitted to become tamei lames. Right? Can't come in contact with the corpse. Why not? Why not? Because we're not sure which one is the Kohen and which one is the Eved. So because we don't know who's the Kohen, therefore neither of them could go in and become Tameh. Ve'enon nosin noshim ben ksheros ben psulos. Then I will say, what's the other problem? These boys can't get married. Why can't they get married? Why can't they get married? Because we don't know who is the Eved and who is the Kohen. So who are they going to marry? Right? An Eved is only permitted to marry a Shivcha. Kohen can't marry a Shivcha. So who are they? So therefore they can't marry. Higdilu atarubos. So this is interesting, but here's the remedy. When these boys, we'll call it the mixed up sons, right? The mixed up sons, when they grow up, v'shichreru zeh. So we'll say, what do they do? Something very interesting. They emancipate one another, right? So they free each other. Because we know one of them is the Kohen, one of them is the Eved. We just don't know who is who. So they're going, they're Meshachra, they free one another. So what's the halacha? V'shichreru zeh. So nosim nashim haru'uyos lekahuna. I will say at that point, then we allow them to marry, but they could only marry women who are technically fit to go ahead and marry a Kohen. Ve'ena metam lamesim, and they still continue on an ongoing basis. They cannot become tamei tumas meis, because at the end of the day, remember again, we don't know who's the Kohen and who's the Eved. Ve'im nitma'u, and if they become tamei, ein sofkin harba, and we don't give them malchus. We don't give them malchus because again, you don't really know who's the Kohen, who's not the Kohen, so you can't punish for an infraction that may or may not have been committed. Ve'enan ochlim b'truma. And again, throughout their lives, they can't eat truma. Because Rabbi will say one of them is a Kohen, one of them is not a Kohen. The one who's the Kohen is entitled to eat. The one who's not the Kohen is not entitled to eat. But because you don't know who is who, therefore they can't eat truma. Ve'emachlu, but if they did eat truma, ein mishalmin karen v'chomesh. So interestingly enough, if they end up eating truma, they don't have to pay karen and chomesh, principal and a penalty fifth. But that's normally what happens if a non-Kohen eats truma. People say, why don't they have to pay it? Because essentially, again, maybe he's a Kohen, so you can't extract money misafek. All right, ve'enon cholkin ala goren, and Abba say halacha l'maisa, if one of these guys shows up at the granary to collect a portion of truma, we will not give it to him. The Gemara says, umochrin es ha truma v'adamin shalahen. So what could they do with their truma? They could sell their truma. So now let's say again, one of these guys separates out truma, so he can't eat it. But what can he do it? He could sell it, and he's allowed to keep the money. He's allowed to keep the money. Then I both say, now the reason he's allowed to keep the money is because of the concept of hamotzi mechavira alav haraya. In other words, so prove to me I'm not a Kohen, and I'll give you the money. Okay, so I can't eat truma, I understand, but if I sell it, I can go in and keep the money. Vein cholkin b'kodshei hamikdash. They do not split in what we call Kodshei HaMikdash. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Ve'in cholkim b'Kodshei HaMikdash kigon oros kodshim. So remember again, I will say, halacha l'maisa, when a Kohen is serving in the Beis HaMikdash and he offers up a karban, the Kohanim get to keep the hides. And any Kohen whose mishmar, right, whose shift it is, gets to share in the hides. Obviously, neither of these individuals could claim their share of the Kodshei Mikdash. Vein nosnin lohem kodshim, we don't give them kodshim. Vein motziin shalahem miyadehem. But halacha l'maisa, if they have kodshim, we can't extract their kodshim from their hands. Take a look at Rashi. What does that mean? Vein motziin shalahem miyadam. Look at Rashi. Im hayu chayavin chatas o asham o ola ein kofin osan lesitin la'anshe mishmar v'lios avodasam ba'ar la'anshe mishmar. Now, I will say it's actually very interesting. We know Kohanim were split up into 24 mishmoros, right? 24 groups. And each group served in the Beis HaMikdash for approximately 1 week a year. When it was your mishmar, right? What was the chap? When it was your mishmar, you got to offer up all of the karbanos. What's the perk in offering up all of the karbanos? So besides the fact that it's a schus to do the avoda, you also get the meat and what? And the hides. And the hides. It's all yours. So I will say there's one exception to this. A Kohen always has a right to offer up his own karbanos. So let's say again, I'm a Kohen, and it's not my week, it's not my shift. A Kohen always has rights in his own karbanos. He does not have to give over his karban to the shift that's on call. So the Gemara says that's what it means when it says, the Mishnah says, Ein motziin shalahem miyadehem. So let's say one of these guys, now remember again, I will say, could one of these guys offer up a karban? Could they offer up a karban? No. In other words, let me clarify. You're right. You could offer a karban. I mean, physically, can they walk into the Beis HaMikdash and do the avoda? And the answer, of course, is no. Because remember, again, who are we talking about over here? We're talking about, these are the two guys who were born to the Kohenes and Shivcha. We don't know who is who. So, of course, they can't come in and actually do the avoda, but at the same time, we can't force them to give over their karban to the Kohanim who are on call. So what they have the right is, they have the right to select who they're going to give that karban to in order to have that particular Kohen offer it. Okay? Ultimately, again, neither of these guys have to separate out Zroa and Lechayim. Remember again the chest, right? And the foreleg, which is normally, again, the portion that you're obligated to go ahead and give to the Kohen. So you can't, again, I will say, what you begin to see over here is that when it comes to matnos kahuna, so ultimately you can't extract that from them, right? Because halacha l'maisa, again, they can always claim, I'm a Kohen. They can make the claim, therefore you can't extract it. So the Gemara says, from the stomach. Ubechora, what about their firstborn animal? So normally you give over the firstborn animal to the Kohen. What happens in this case? Yehiroa achi yistaiv. You allow the animal to graze until it becomes blemished. V'nosnin alav chumrei kohanim v'chumrei Yisrael. And in general, again, I will say what you see is, what do you do with these two men? What do you do with them? You give them the chumras of kahuna and the chumras of Yisrael. And again, what exactly that means, Emir Hashem, we are going to see. Sorry, just making sure. Okay, so good. So we'll say, so again, so just to be clear, it's actually a pretty straightforward case. So remember again, what you have over here is the Kohenes and the Shivcha giving birth to two boys. What happened? We just don't know who belongs to who. So essentially what the Gemara says is, you have to treat, the Mishnah says, you have to treat them with the chumras of both being a Kohen and a non-Kohen. Now again, remember, when they're young, it's more problematic. When they get older, the first step is they emancipate one another. So at least we know now we're not dealing with an Eved and a Kohen. What are we dealing with? A Yisrael and a Kohen. But nevertheless, again, the Mishnah just tells me how I leverage all of my Kohanic risk in this particular situation. Good. Says the Gemara. So obviously, we're going to go through each of these cases in the Gemara. Meisuak Sherim. So we'll say, remember again, in the previous part of the Mishnah, once again, remember the Mishnah started out with the case of Ha'isha Shenis Ariv Vlada Bivlad Kalosa. A woman and her daughter-in-law ultimately again get their sons mixed up. So the Mishnah referred to as Ksherim. So the Gemara says, Ela Hanach Mishum Deiruva Lo Havi Psulin. So we'll say, I understand, if you call one group Ksherim, what does that make it sound like? That the other group are psulim. Now they're not psulim. What happened? There were two sets of brothers. One set of brothers that we know definitively who they belong to, and another set of brothers that we're not sure. So why do you call what? So Elohanach mishum de'erav havelu psulin. Amrapapa no ema umesu havadoin. Take out the word ksherim and replace it with what? Vadoin. That there are two groupings of brothers. There are brothers who are vadoin. Vadoin means that we know definitively who their mother is. And then there's another group, ultimately, again, of the mixed up group. Okay. Libnei akala echad cholis. So dafka michlatz v'hadir yibumi. Aval yibumi bereisha lo dekapaga b'yivam l'shak. It was what we saw before. In any of these cases where you have to go through chalitza, and then the last brother could do yibum, the order is very specific. It always has to first be chalitza, and then yibum afterwards. Because if you start with yibum, you run the risk that what? That if it's not the actual brother who's marrying this woman, he's marrying a woman who really is subject to yibum. So therefore, again, you take care of that by first doing chalitza. You exhaust your chalitza options, and then after you exhaust your chalitza options, then yibum becomes permitted. Good, weiter. Kohen shenis arif. So let's remember again, the Mishnah said, so now we're focusing on the last case over here. So remember, in the last case in the Mishnah, we spoke about a kohenes and a shivcha. They both give birth to sons. Their sons get mixed up. So remember again, what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said, Cholkin chelek echad bagoren. Literally, they get one portion. These two women get one portion at the granary. So says the Gemara, what does this mean? So the Gemara says, chelek echad pshita. Now obviously they only get one portion, Rabbi say, because why? Because technically speaking, actually, look at Rashi. Rashi says, no, not yet, sorry. So, chelek echad pshita, ema chelek ke'echad. Rather, what it means is they get their portion as one. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Chelek ke'echad, im bo shneim al hagoren. If both of them came to the granary to collect truma, so nosnin lahem, we give to them, right? We give to them. Aval zeh below zeh ein cholkin lahem. But Lamaisi Sirba say, here's the problem. We're only going to give them truma if they show up together. If they show up independently, we're not going to give them truma. Now finish that Rashi. The kasavar ein cholkin truma li eved ela imkin rabo imo dilma asid laasukin liyuchsin desavri koinu. So Rabbi say, this is fascinating. We're going to see now that there is an opinion that holds that halacha lamaisa, you cannot distribute truma. Now, okay, let's take a step back. An eved is permitted to eat truma, okay? Even though an eved is permitted to eat truma, there is a school of thought that says you only give truma to an eved in the presence of his master. Why? What are we concerned about? Because if you go ahead and you distribute truma to an eved, people could get confused, and they could assume that the reason the eved is getting truma is why? Because he's a kohen. The only way to obviate that concern is to always make sure that you're giving truma to the eved in the presence of his master. That way people know, oh, this is the kohen, this is the eved. So the Gemara says over here, interestingly enough, in this case, where you have the mix-up of the sons, we're only going to distribute to the kohenes and to the shivcha when they are together. To which the Gemara says, Pshita imachila ke'echad. So tonight, kimandamar in cholkin truma li eved, ela imkin rabo imo. Rabbi say the Mishnah is coming to teach us that we hold of the opinion that says you only distribute truma to an eved if the eved is in the presence of his master. And again, the reason for that is we don't want anyone to erroneously think that what? That halacha l'maisa, the eved is really a kohen. Disanya, ein cholkin truma li eved ela imkin rabo imo, because we learned that you can't go ahead and distribute truma to an eved unless, of course, the master is there. Divrei Rabbi Huda. These are the words of Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yachol. Rabbi Yossi says, yes, you can. You could distribute truma even to an eved not in the presence of a kohen. Why? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Yachol sheyomar im kohen anitinu li b'shvil atzmi v'im eved kohen anitinu b'shvil Rabbi. Because Rabbi Yossi holds that halacha l'maisa, the eved can say, listen, either way, give me my truma. If I'm a kohen, right? Give me that truma. If I'm an eved, give me my truma. So Rabbi Yossi holds that eved could go ahead and collect truma, ultimately even not in the presence of his master. Then I both say, what is at the root of this dispute? Watch this. So the Gemara says, Bimkomo Rabbi Huda hayu ma'alin mitruma liyuchsin, Bimkomo Rabbi Yossi lo hayu ma'alin mitruma liyuchsin. So I both say, here it comes. Here is the issue. What's the concern? The concern is that if we allow you to go ahead and eat truma, isn't that potentially a stempel, right? A stamp of approval, a seal of approval on your yichus. So Rabbi say in the locale of Rabbi Yehuda, they would assume that if somebody was consuming truma, that was like a seal of approval on their yichus as a kohen. Therefore, again, if you do that, it's dangerous to give truma to the eved not in the presence of his master. Why? Because if people see that eved eating truma and they don't know him, the default assumption is what? What is he? What is he? A kohen. And now you run the risk of an eved going ahead and masquerading as a kohen. That's why Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, the only way to distribute truma to an eved is in the presence of his master. The Gemara just pointed out, Rabbi Yehuda says that because in Rabbi Yehuda's locale, they would go ahead and they would go and establish yichus based on truma consumption. However, bimkomo Rabbi Yossi, lo hayu ma'alin mitrum liyuchsin. But in the locale of Rabbi Yossi, they would not go ahead and establish yichus based on truma consumption, and therefore what? And therefore halacha l'maisa, in the locale of Rabbi Yossi, they would allow an eved to receive truma even not in the presence of his master. So it says the Gemara Tanya, Amar Rabbi Lazar bar Tzadok was an interesting case. Miyamai lohi areti ela eidos echad. So I will say, Rabbi Lazar bar Tzadok said, in general, I was careful to never go ahead and give eidos. Give eidos. One time I did, right? Ela eidos echad. Vehelu eved lekahuna alpi. So one time I did, Rabbi Lazar says, and it was a disaster. Because of my edus, they made an eved into a kohen. What happened over here? So the Gemara says, "Vehelu eved lekahuna alpi. Helu sagalaitva." I don't understand. Really? From Rabbi Lazar's statement, from Rabbi Lazar's edus, they made an eved into a kohen. To which the Gemara says, "Hashta." If HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't allow bad things to happen through the animals of tzaddikim, so Rebbe say this is talking about the donkey. Rashi points out of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. The donkey would not eat untithed produce. So if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is careful, that we'll talk about that more tomorrow, Mirz Hashem. But Lamais, again, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is careful, that's what? That ultimately bad things don't happen through the animals of tzaddikim. So of course nothing bad is going to happen through the tzaddik himself. So how could it be that through Rabbi Lazar, ultimately again he was going to go ahead and cause an eved to be regarded as a kohen? To which the Gemara says, "Elaima bikshu lalos eved lekunalpi." To which the Gemara says, no. What happened over here is, we'll see what the story is in just a moment. Rabbi Lazar says, based on something I did, they were ready to establish the identity of this kohen, of this eved as a kohen. What happened? Chaza ba'asred Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi say, watch this. Here's what happened. Rabbi Lazar saw a man eating truma, and this happened in the locale of Rabbi Yossi. Now I will say, remember again, Rabbi Yossi holds that what? That we do not establish yichus based on truma consumption. Therefore, in the city of Rabbi Yossi, what happened? Halacha l'maisa, again, you could give truma to an eved even not in the presence of his master. So this is what Rabbi Lazar sees. So Rabbi Lazar goes to the town of Rabbi Yossi, and in the town of Rabbi Yossi, he sees a guy eating truma. And what happened? Va'asid ba'asrid Rabbi Yehuda. And he then went ahead and gave testimony about this in the city of Rabbi Yehuda. Then I both say in the city of Rabbi Yehuda, what's the halacha? In Rabbi Yehuda's city, they were ma'ala mitruma liyuchsin. So I will say, so you see what ended up happening over here? He saw a guy eating truma in the city of Rabbi Yossi. Now, in the city of Rabbi Yossi, they do not establish yichus based on truma consumption. So therefore, they'll give truma even to an eved not in the presence of his master. But then Rabbi Lazar went and testified about this guy in the city of Rabbi Yehuda. Well, in the city of Rabbi Yehuda, they will go ahead and what? They do establish yuchsin based on truma consumption. And therefore, again, Rabbi Lazar testified, I saw this guy eating truma. Oh, you saw him eating truma, so they were about to declare him as a kohen. Ultimately, again, until they went ahead and did a little bit of fact checking and then realized, You saw him eating truma in the locale of Rabbi Yossi, but in the locale of Rabbi Yossi, they allow an eved to eat truma even not in the presence of his master, because they don't establish yichus based on truma consumption. I both say, just in the minutes we have left, just to talk about this just a moment, the Gemara talks about this idea of behemtom shel tzadikim, ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevi takala al yadan. Right, that Hashem does not bring negative things, right? Aveirus, ultimately, again, through the animals of tzaddikim. And again, the proof is, Rei Pinchas ben Yair, his animal would not eat untithed produce. Would not eat untithed produce. So I will say, so what's the pshat with that? What's the pshat that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't bring sinful or negative behavior through the animals of tzaddikim? So I will say, so a beautiful idea by the Shem Shmuel. Sakar Chavareba says something so beautiful. He says, when a person lives a life of Kiddusha, when a person lives a life of holiness, not only does that holiness permeate the self, but that holiness permeates everything that is associated with you as well. So a person lives a life of Kiddusha, the Kiddusha seeps into my family, the Kiddusha seeps into my friends, the Kiddusha seeps into my community, the Kiddusha seeps into my home, and the Kiddusha even permeates my livestock. To the point that when I lead a life of Kiddusha, even my livestock, even my animals become holy as well. That's the pshat, says the Bnei Yissaschar, behemton shel tzadikim, ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mevi takala al yadan. That when you have a tzaddik, a person who strives to live a life of Kiddusha, that Kiddusha seeps into his livestock as well, to the point that even the livestock doesn't want to engage in spirit, or doesn't engage in spiritually negative behavior. See, I will say the power of Kiddusha. We often think about just living a life of holiness as something that impacts me and me alone. But we have to realize is that every step forward in our Kiddusha sends a beautiful and dramatic ripple effect to everyone and everything around us. Shkar Chabasi will stop over here. All right, Chavran Zoom, have a great day.
Yeah, buddy. How many marriages do I have?